I have a bottle of Black Metal. You know, there's an old tradition of pouring a bottle of the original beer into, but would that be the mash or rather in the boil? What do you think? Or should it be?
Well, for us, I would actually probably pour it into into the wort to introduce the yeast. But you know, that's the way we do things. We like our beer infected. So here, I don't know. Whatever you think is appropriate. Whatever the tradition calls for.
I'll talk to Jacob about it. I just remember some old Mikkeller collaborations where they did that, or was it Jeppe?
Yeah, we're hoping to do that at Fantôme next week, if we can find some old Fantôme bottles to...
There's some infection for you, for sure.
To introduce some of the old Fantôme infection into whatever we brew.
That shouldn't be difficult to find an infection there. No.
Hi, I'm Ron Extract. I'm one of the owners of Jester King Brewery in Austin, Texas. This is Garrett Crowell, our head brewer.
So yeah, tell us about Jester King. Who are Jester King and how did you start up?
Well, we broke ground on the brewery in 2010. My partner Jeff Stuffings had come up with the idea for Jester King a couple of years prior to that, and actually I think 3 or 4 years prior to that, and had been working on it quite some time at that point. His brother Michael is our third partner. He had moved down to Austin to work with Jeff on the project, and I met them in 2009 and joined up with them shortly thereafter. A lot of our ambition was to create authentic farmhouse ales in the Texas Hill Country, and what that's meant to us is something that's really evolved over the first 4 or 5 years of our history, and Garrett has had a lot to do with that in really introducing mixed yeast fermentation into our brewery, working with multiple strains of both commercial yeast and native wild yeast souring bacteria, working with a lot of different organisms to create a great deal more complexity in our beers.
Yeah, tell us about that, because you've harvested wild yeast.
Yep.
You haven't used cultivated yeast.
Yep, some of the yeast in our blend is cultivated lab yeast, or at one point in time it was. It's been mutated kind of to its own thing through successive generations in our brewery. But a lot of the wild yeast character comes from things on our property, like wildflowers that grow there. We put them in wort and just let it ferment, and then took that yeast and introduced it to our house mix culture, and even some of the stuff from our spontaneous fermentations has gone into our house culture. So a lot of the wild character we have in our beer really is representative of our surroundings and kind of the flora that we have around our brewery. Have you ever tried to have both farmhouse ales and ordinary hoppy ales, or as you usually see from American breweries, Imperial Stouts, hoppy IPAs, can you mix that in the same brewery?
When we first started out, that was some of what we were doing, and I guess a model for that was a brewery like Russian River, which does both very good hoppy West Coast ales, IPAs, and then wild ales using wild yeast and bacteria. And we did do that for a long time. Originally, we were making clean beers in our brew house and in our stainless steel tanks, and then in order to introduce wild character into them, we were transferring them to barrels for secondary fermentation, where they were inoculated with mature beer containing wild yeast and bacteria. So we were for several years making a combination of clean and wild beer, and for a while we worked with a couple of different strains of commercial yeast to make the clean beer. Ultimately we decided to focus on a strain that was originally from Brasserie Thirier in France. We really liked the flavors that strain contributed, but then that ended up becoming somewhat of a stepping stone to working with multi-strain yeast as part of our primary fermentation as well. Garrett, you were going to add something to that?
Yeah, I found that the clean beers we were making, the one thing that my criticism is that they were missing wild character, and I wanted an IPA that eventually developed a Brettanomyces character or got a little tart over time, and so why not ferment that with a mixed culture? And I mean that's kind of our yeast blend has a lot of bacteria in it as well, and if we don't use a lot of hops, like at the rate of hopping an IPA, oftentimes the beer will become very sour. So as such, we can use hops kind of as a lever to regulate acidity in our beer. So we made a beer called Witchmaker. We make a beer called Witchmaker that originally was it's gone through several phases. Originally fermented with an English ale yeast, then with the French farmhouse yeast, and now with the mixed culture. And I think it's like 60 IBUs or so, but it doesn't get sour. It'll get funky, like it'll develop kind of that horsey Brettanomyces character over time, but
maybe just a little hint of like a lemony tartness.
Tiny bit of acidity is very nice.
Yeah. And interestingly, that's a beer where when we switched from making it with an English yeast to farmhouse yeast, we liked it, but there was just something about the combination of the yeast character and the American hops that we were using that could clash a little bit in some batches, that we weren't always quite happy with how those worked together until we introduced the mixed yeast fermentation, and we felt that the introduction of the wild yeast and bacteria really brought those flavors together in a way that made that beer, in our collective opinion, much better than really it had ever been in the past. So it's a beer that I don't think any of us at Jester King really drank all that much of before, and now I think it's really one of our collective favorites.
It doesn't stay around long.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, with the wild fermentation with Brettanomyces, we find that the hop character in the beer stays fresh for longer. I think Chad from Crooked Stave has kind of correlated that to Brettanomyces being really great at scavenging oxygen. So the hops don't oxidize in the bottle, and it seems fresher longer. It's very, very interesting.
It is. State of Texas had some really strange legislation when it came to alcohol, and
it still does.
But you didn't agree with them though, so you're taking.
We still don't.
But there was a process in the lawsuit. Can you tell a little bit about this?
Yeah, absolutely. We were approached by an attorney named Jim Houchins, who's also a friend of ours and also one of the principal owners of a distribution company called Authentic Beverage. He had been wanting to challenge a lot of these laws that were on the books in Texas for a long time. For example, one of the ones that was at the core of the lawsuit was a law saying that anything over 4% alcohol by weight, which is approximately 5.1% alcohol by volume, can't be labeled as beer. It has to be called either ale or malt liquor. Those were the only legal terms that could be used for those products. And of course that conflicts with the definitions of those terms that exist most everywhere else in the world, where all malt beverages are beer and ale is specifically top fermented beer, which may well be below 5.1% alcohol by volume or 4% by weight. And there were several laws of this nature on the books. There was also one that prohibited brewers from talking about alcohol content, that we could put it on the labels but otherwise not publish it anywhere other than on the bottle labels itself or on images of the bottle labels. And that we weren't allowed to tell customers tell consumers where our beers were sold. And also in addition to that, weren't allowed to sell them directly to consumers at our brewery. So it was Jim's idea to challenge a lot of these in court. He felt that there were First Amendment arguments against some of the limitations on our ability to communicate accurately what the beer contained or where it was sold or what type of product it was. And then he also felt that there were some 14th Amendment issues with some of the other claims. First Amendment is right to free and open speech. 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law. So he felt that because we were in essentially the same business as wineries, but our products were regulated so much differently, that was an injustice that we might be able to challenge. He managed to enlist the help of a First Amendment attorney named Pete Kennedy, who was really instrumental to this, and we won all of our First Amendment claims. We were able to overturn the regulation on beer labels and the restriction on talking about alcohol content or saying where our beer was sold. He had approached several breweries about joining the suit, and we had hoped that we would be able to convince our guild, the Texas Craft Brewers Guild, to join it as a group, but there wasn't enough consensus to make it happen, so we decided that we would do it individually. and we worked with Jim, an authentic beverage, and then a restaurant in town called Zach's, and collectively challenged these. And we won on some of the counts. We lost on others. We were not successful in overturning the restriction on selling beer directly to consumers, and we also challenged part of how part of the regulatory system with respect to out-of-state brewers, that we felt that it was pretty odd that Texas charged fees to foreign brewers rather than to their U.S. importers, and that conflicted with the rights of federal government to regulate importation into the U.S., but we were unsuccessful in that challenge as well. We did the work with some of our fellow brewers and with the Texas Craft Brewers Guild and our lobbyists to help change some of the other laws subsequently in the last legislative session. We were able to make some changes so that production brewers can now sell a small amount of beer to consumers only to drink on site. They can't take the beer away. And brew pubs, which had previously not been allowed to sell their beer except at their brewery, they could only sell it directly to consumers. They couldn't send it out to restaurants or bars or stores. They gained the right to distribute their beer. Following those changes, we actually changed our license over to a brew pub, which gave us a little bit more flexibility to send our beer out for distribution as well as selling it on site, both to drink on site and to take away.
Interesting. We have the same laws in Norway. So
really?
Maybe we need someone like you to come and sue the government.
Yeah. Well, we're still having, there's still a lot of fights that are ongoing though, because as part of our package, we had bills that we were very happy with, and there are 2 wholesalers lobbies in Texas. One of the wholesalers lobbies that also signed on with our bills. We had reached an agreement that we felt was good for everyone. But then the other wholesalers lobby ended up opposing our bills initially until they managed to tack on another one which made it illegal for breweries to sell their distribution rights. And this is still fairly common practice throughout the U.S. that a brewery will initially self-distribute. They'll sell their beer directly to restaurants and bars and stores. And then once they've built up a little bit of a following, once they have some established business, they'll then turn those rights over to a third-party distributor in exchange for compensation. Which is kind of a win-win, because the brewery would then use that money in most cases to expand and offer the distributor even more beer to be able to sell. And of course the distributor's getting an established brand out of the deal, but the distributors, some of the distributors at least, decided that it would be better not to have to pay for those rights, so they managed to pass a law making it illegal for brewers to sell territorial rights to distributors, but explicitly legal for distributors to sell those same rights to one another. So now in Texas, once a brewer reaches a certain size and they're too big to continue self-distributing, they have to hire a distributor, and they have to just give away part of their territory to that distributor, who could then literally walk out the door and 5 minutes later sell it to another distributor for tens of millions of dollars. And we feel that's something that's really unreasonable, needs to be changed. The laws relating to licensing of foreign brewers are still in place. So for example, Amager doesn't sell beer in Texas because it would cost them $6,000 every 2 years approximately to sell their beer into Texas, whereas they could sell their beer throughout the rest of the United States for less than that. And it would specifically cost Amager that money, not their US importer, Shelton Brothers. Shelton Brothers could pay it, but they would need to pay it on behalf of every single brewery that they represent. They can't just get one license to sell all their products, which is how it works for wine and spirits. If they were a wine importer, all they would need is one license and they could sell their entire portfolio into the state. But for beer, each brewery requires a separate one. And it's as though the US importer doesn't even exist. They have written the law so that all the relationships are between the foreign brewery and their Texas distributor, and that's kind of contrary to the way that the importation and distribution system in the US actually works. So it's still a big problem, still something that we want to see changed in the next legislative session. And there's a battle between some bigger, very powerful distributors and small breweries that's going on many fronts throughout the US. In Florida, distributors have been trying to require breweries to pay distributors commission effectively in order to sell their own beer. So a brewery, before selling a beer in its tap room, would need to first sell the beer to the distributor and then buy it back. The beer never even moves, but they have to sell it to the distributor and then buy it back at a 30 or 40% markup in order to just sell it to consumers at their breweries. And that's the sort of issues that we're facing. It looks like that won't pass in Florida, but had it passed, pretty sure we would have seen similar legislation in Texas next time around, and we may still. So it's an ongoing battle to try to fight for the interests of small artisan breweries.
Last question to you. If you have two Jester King beers that you really want to profile to people who don't know you, might be interesting, which type of beers would that be?
I would say we make a beer called Noble King, which is just kind of a pale, slightly hoppy, like noble hops, saison or farmhouse ale. But I feel that beer presents our mixed culture best. It's just a very simple beer, fermented all in stainless steel. I think that's very representative of what we do. And also, I would say one of our barrel-aged beers, probably Russ or RU55, that kind of really exemplifies what kind of our environment of barrel aging beer and putting beer in oak.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I would definitely agree with him on Noble King. I think that it's been very important to us to show what we can do with simple ingredients, because we feel like that's where a brewer really showcases their skills and their philosophies, working with simple ingredients and showing the direction that they go with that. And for us, it's really about fermentation. The yeast is always the star of the show. I think for my second one, as much as I love Russ, I probably would have picked one of our fruit re-fermentations. Yep. Perhaps Cerveza de Tempranillo, which is a beer that we re-fermented with wine grapes, or maybe Nocturne Chrysalis, which is a beer that we re-fermented with blackberries. We really like introducing fruit into beer as part of the process, allowing the sugars and the fruit to ferment, allowing the flavors to come together, creating something that's really ideally more than the sum of its parts. And those beers for me showcase that very well. But it's hard to pick my two favorite children. You know, if we weren't happy with any of our beers, we wouldn't release them, and we haven't. I mean, we've had beers that we haven't been happy with that we haven't released. That's part of the process, is that we will make bad beer. I mean, we embrace nature, we work in partnership with nature, and we have to work with what nature gives us, which isn't always good. So some of our beer isn't going to be usable, both what we age in barrels and what we ferment in stainless steel. But our job at that point becomes to serve as curators of the beer, and to make sure that what is good and what we feel is worthy is what ultimately gets released or what gets used in blends.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope to see you along here in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Likewise, thank you.
And fight the power.
Yeah. Damn the man.
All right, good.
Yeah.
For the farmhouse version, a little bit, we felt that it was a little more complex, it was drier, it was more to our tastes, but a lot of our customers prefer the English pale yeast version, and to this day we still get emails asking if we're ever going to brew it again.
So you can say yes, we did?
Yeah, we'll say yes, we did brew it again. Unfortunately, you can't buy it in Texas, but if you go to Denmark,